Top of the hour. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you for our third weekly Baseline Tech Talk. On today's agenda is going to be flow management and specifically some things you want to do during startup when you're on site, which would be learning the flow. And Dan is going to talk about some methods to do that, some reasons why you want to learn flow, how to prepare to learn flow, and then some differences between learning flow on site and learning flow through Base Manager. And I think it's something that is often forgotten. And so as we get into this, we'll probably all relate to being on sites that have equipment, whether it's baseline or other, and the system was never learned. And so part of today is making sure that everybody knows the process so that when we go out to start systems up, we can pick up the pieces and kick off the year in the right way. Right. So with that, why don't you take us from here, Dan?
Okay, great. I always think that the question we should ask about anything that we're doing is why are we doing it? So let's talk about the why we want to learn flow and some of the benefits that we get from that. So, what are some of the things that you have seen in different markets that kind of answer flow? My first one is that I've seen that it gets us into all the right alerts and shutdowns that are based on flow. Because if somebody doesn't have a learned flow set up, a lot of the alerts and the flow limits, those things aren't going to be accurate. So, what absolutely.
I think for sure that is probably the number one. Is if we have a broken mainline pipe or a broken lateral pipe or broken sprinklers, and we have the equipment that is capable and designed to shut the system down and alert you, that we should make sure it's set up to do so, because all of our customers have invested in this technology and we want to make sure that the investment that they've made is actually set up and working accordingly. And then one of the other things I see is that it's really the best way to manage concurrent zones. And so if you have a site that, and I get this request a lot, they say, hey, Andy, how do I set this controller up to run 3 or 4 zones at a time? And there's complicated ways to set that up, and there's easier ways to set that up. And one of the best ways is to learn the flow and then tell the system I want to run 85 gallons a minute and let it run as many zones as it can to maximize that 85 gallons per minute without doing any fancy math or setting up any program concurrent runs, et cetera. So I think that's probably the second reason, Dan, is to run zones concurrently and really maximize that flow.
But so if you haven't learned flow, you aren't going to get that. You aren't going to be able
Correct.
to get that managed with concurrency. So yeah, that is really significant.
Mm-hmm. Another important thing to consider too is as we're starting up and we're starting a new irrigation season, you may or may not be accountable to the property owner for the amount of water used through the irrigation season. So it is possible that pressures have changed in water supplies that could impact your flow rates in your system as you're irrigating. And so you want to calibrate or recalibrate your learned flows at the beginning of the year so that your reports and analytics are as accurate as possible when you're accounting for how much water you've used.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah, right. That's a good point. So even if you've learned flow, say last September, it's a good idea to do it again at the beginning of the year to make sure you're setting, quote, a new baseline for the current season.
Right. That kind of cues us up for, when do we want to do it? You're kind of leading us to when we're going out to a site, maybe a spring startup. It's a great time to do it, right? Something may have changed since last year and this year. So Chris alludes to pressure changing, and that's going to have an impact on flow. Some of the other changes could be, someone have added heads or decreased heads or changed from a spray system to a drip system. Those are significant changes to the flow, and we need to relearn flow for that to have accurate flow. So that once a year is a great time to relearn flow.
Yeah, and let me mention one more thing, Dan. It's important to know that your system is, let's say, fully intact. In other words, if you're going to learn flow remotely, which Dan is going to get into in a minute, it's important to know that you don't have any broken heads or broken pipe. And the only way to know that is to be on site and do a full site inspection first prior to learning the flow. And so during that spring startup, when you're doing a physical, say, eyeball check on every zone, you're really making sure that the system is fully operational. And that's, another good reason to do the learn flow at startup.
Right on. Right on. Yeah. So as we get ready to how we prepare for this one, first thing you got to do is we've got to make sure you have a flow sensor, right? Because not everybody has a flow sensor, but having them is important. So Andy, do you have your control point handy?
I do.
Yeah,
I do. So this is what we call a control point. Let me turn it this way, which consists of the flow sensor. Let's see if I can pull it out here. Flow sensor with the paddle wheel.
Nice.
And then also on our control point, I'll just mention that we have our pressure sensor and then the master valve decoder. So the control point is an all-in-one device that allows you to read all of these data points sort of pre-configured from the factory, all in one.
Right. So then
this here.
Then I've got just just that portion of it, just the flow sensor that's in there. So if we've got that installed, then we can read the flow. And then one of the things that I think is real important is to inspect the paddle wheel. So Andy, could you hold it up to the camera a little bit and give it a little spin? So, we want to make sure that that's intact, because those have a bushing or a bearing in there that can wear, or debris can get stuck in there. And if it's not spinning freely or if it's sloppy, there's going to be some issues on that. So it doesn't hurt to check that. And it's always easier to do it while the water's off, right? Because once you've energized a system, you need to drain it out, because you're going to have to pull this whole thing out. We're just going to have just a bare hole on the pipe. And if it's full of water, it's going to fill up that valve box.
Yeah, definitely check this out before you energize the piping system.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm going to share my screen real quick and show you some of the other things we want to check. So you mentioned, making sure that the system doesn't have any broken heads. Now, if we learn flow on this system right here with 4 broken heads, that's going to throw off all of our learned flow. The other thing we need to do is we need to make sure that no other water is running on the site. So if someone's manually irrigating, that's going to throw off our flow. Or if someone else is just watering, that's also going to throw things off. So those are things that we want to make sure aren't going on while we're learning flow. Now, if Chris is trying to manually run a system through the controller, a zone through the controller, that won't allow it. But if Andy is doing that, manually watering, bleeding it, or running a quick couple of things, that will throw off my flow. So we call that unscheduled flow. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen. So we want to make sure that there's 2 different ways to learn flow, right? So we can learn flow by individual zone or by the entire program. So the zone level flow is great if we've made changes just to one particular zone. But then for the entire program or program learn flow, better for it's a quicker way to move through it, right? So initially setting up a system after an installation, if we want to go through an entire program, and I can schedule program watering. So let's take a look at that. I'll come back to my video. And so at the controller, I can turn the zone, and here I'm going to double check and look at my control point or my flow value. So here I do have a flow sensor installed, and I do have a correct K value. So having that correct K value is pretty important in that that's going to translate into flow. And if we don't have that accurate, that can really throw things off.
And I'll point out, if you want to pause that for a second, Dan, when you're utilizing a baseline sensor, we pre-program the device with the K value. And so that's automatically loaded into the controller when utilizing a baseline sensing device. If you're using a third-party sensing device, such as a data industrial sensor, then you will want to make sure you bring with you or use your phone to look it up on their website to find their K value and enter that in.
Right. Because what would happen is if somebody had changed that K value, you might be expecting 50 gallons a minute and it's throwing 120, and that's not accurate because the K value is not in there correctly. So having that right one is important. So on the flow dial, I'm navigating to zone learn flow operations here. So we're going to look at just individual zones. And as I scroll through here, I'm going to use or scroll through it, and you'll see that none of the zones have been learn flow. So nothing yet. So definitely it's going to be quicker for me to learn by the program. So I'm going to come up to the entire program level, which is just the next menu down, and open that up. And we see nothing's been learned here. But now what I can do is navigate over to the date and set a date and a time by hitting plus. I'm just going to hold down the plus, and I'm going to set it till about 8 o'clock tonight. So at 8:03, it's going to it's scheduled to run and to learn flow for all the zones in program 1. All I got to do is turn it back to run, and it will do it. Now, if we take a look, we'll see that the color code is showing that it's ready to learn flow. So that'll happen tonight. So that's a unique color code throughout. Let's take a look at it if we were to do it remotely. So if we go into Base Manager and log into my particular controller, I can learn it through Quick View. So in Quick View, I can come to the zones, and right here I've got the Learn Flow. I can just click on Learn Flow, and as soon as I'm done, it will learn flow right now. So that's for an individual zone. Or I can learn through an individual one program and learn flow for a particular program. And again, it will learn right now. But if I want to schedule that, I'm going to go to the Live View tab. And just like I'm at the controller, right, where it's virtual button pushes for the controller. I'm actually manipulating the controller real time. So I can learn flow by the individual zone, or I can learn flow by the entire program. This is exactly the same as if I was there. I'm just not physically pushing the buttons. I'm doing it through Base Manager.
Hey, Dan.
Yes, sir.
We've got a couple of relevant questions pop up that we should address right now.
Good.
One of them is by Michael Skidgill. Thanks for chiming in. It says, he asks, how long will zones run in Learn Flow?
Ooh, excellent question. Well, it's going to need long enough for the flow to stabilize. So whatever our pipe fill time is that we've been put in there, plus some additional time. So it needs to have a stable flow, and then it will put it in there. So it's not going to run its full program time, but just the once it gets to a stabilized flow.
So typically 3 minutes per zone is the operation time to learn flow. Another good question by Keith Bruns is, does learn flow take priority over normal program operation?
Good question.
I know the answer to that.
Good. You're going to let me twist on this for a moment.
This is one of those moments where we ask the question, how does our shit work? So yes, when you have a program learn flow, it will take priority over a scheduled program runtime.
Makes sense.
So if you have a scheduled start time of 8 p.m. and you coincide that with a program learn flow, the program learn flow will take priority. It will go through that process, and then once it's complete, it will operate the program start time cycle.
Now, one of the challenges with that, though, and this is just for everybody to be aware of, is you may have said a program can run 3 to 5 zones concurrently all at the same time. But when we get to learn flow, it's only going to run them one by one by one. So it would extend that time, where normally that program might be a shorter condensed time, but a learn flow period could be longer than you might have expected.
Yes, and the two are independent of each other.
Correct, yeah. Good point. Excellent. Any other questions related to that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. No, it's perfect. It's good to bring those up right then. Okay. So what I wanted to show you here was, once we've learned flow, oh, I went too far. Once we've learned flow, I can go into my mainline settings and zone assignments. Now I can see the real flows that have been populated, right? So once I see these flows, then I know that I've actually learned the flow, and then the controller has those flows to use going forward.
Yeah, Dan, I'll add something there too. We totally understand that if you have a system with, say, 40 to 80 to 100 to 200 zones, that it's not generally realistic to stand there for 3 minutes a zone for 200 zones while it goes around and does this. But I do believe it's important to learn 3 or 4 of them when you're on site, especially if you have maybe a well or a pumping system that can have differences in pressure that could throw off the learn throw value. That it's nice to learn a couple flows while you're there, make sure everything's functioning properly, and then you can set it to either continue or program it to learn later, but you've checked that everything's working correctly in the process.
Yeah, because that could be bad if your flow sensor wasn't assigned properly, or if you didn't have the right K value and you thought you were learning flow, and you come back the next day and you wasted all that time. You need to start the process all over again. Yeah. So once we've started that learn flow process, the controller, if we haven't scheduled it, it's going to learn flow immediately, and it'll do that one by one. And then if we schedule it at that particular time, it would then run them one by one, allow that flow to stabilize, and then it will just move on to the next one as it moves through. So I think you kind of bring up a point, Andy, about the time it might take to learn flow. There's some extra time that can be spent on site with this one, especially if we want contractors or water managers to kind of check these as they run through some of them. Any thoughts on essentially some extra expense or extra effort on the part of the contractor?
Yeah, this brings up a point that we were talking about the other day. That it could be easily missed, and I would love to hear some feedback either from the folks that are on the call here today or from your customers. And that is anybody charging to set this up and go through this programming process? Because I think it's something that has a ton of value, that if there's not time in the typical schedule to just give a full day away for free while you're learning the flow on a 100-zone system, that you mention it to your customer and your client, and you mention the capabilities of the controller, and you mention the benefits of learning the flow and setting this up correctly, and that you charge them to do it, because it does take time, and nobody says that we have to do all of this work for free. And I think that by putting together perhaps a proposal and charging for it and adding that value, you're sort of reassuring or reaffirming to your customer what you're doing on site, what they have, and what the value is for you to be managing their site. So give that some thought if you are a contractor or even a distributor that wants to offer this as a service for their contractors or for end clients. That I think it's something we can all charge for.
Good. It's definitely something to strive for. I like that.
Very good. We got a couple of other questions that came in that are excellent and relevant. Tom Campbell asks, can you adjust the offset values to match a city meter with a flow meter? And then kind of in same vein, Mr. Noonan asks, where can I edit learn flow value in Base Manager? So yes, these learn flows can be automated, but you can also input different values manually in Base Manager, either assigning a design flow for a mainline or inputting a design flow for an individual zone. If you don't have a flow meter and you want to manage concurrency by flow, you can manually input those values, but if you don't have a master valve and flow sensor associated with it, you wouldn't be able to respond to any variances of high flow or low flow according to either that lateral line or that main line.
Yeah.
And then it is possible, like Andy mentioned, if it's a baseline branded flow sensor or hydrometer, the decoder that comes with that meter is pre-programmed for the size of that meter, so that it will adjust your K value and offset, but you can manually input both K value and offset for other branded meters and or flow sensors.
Wonderful. That's good.
Awesome. I love how Tom is saying here that he does charge every time he logs into a client's controller. So congrats, Tom. Cheers. Love that.
More of that, please, from the industry.
All right. Very good. Moving on.
Any more? I think I've got the bulk of what I wanted to bring across. We got any more questions that make sense on this portion?
Another a good question. Keith Bruns asks, please discuss the major difference between the use of a control point and a hydrometer, which is better and downsides to each. Now, this is my point where, since it's National Beer Day, we can discuss the difference between a hydrometer and a hydrometer. So in the irrigation, we are utilizing hydrometers, not hydrometers. Hydrometers are instruments used to measure the gravity of a liquid in the fermentation process, i.e. beer production. Yeah. A hydrometer is a master valve and a flow sensor combined into one unit that will measure the amount of water flowing through your hydraulic structure. So with that being said, little side note, Andy, what's the major advantages to a hydrometer versus a traditional?
Yeah, so I think I want to start by sort of the way I like to describe a control point is it isn't necessarily a particular piece of hardware. So yes, I may be holding what we call a physical control point. And as I look in the camera, this just looks like a bunch of wires. But a control point is a combination of a flow sensor, a pressure sensor, and a master valve. And it doesn't have to be these devices. It could be somebody else's pressure sensor with our decoder. It could be somebody else's flow sensor with our decoder. And it could be any master valve of your choice. A hydrometer can also be programmed as a control point because a control point is a setting in the controller, and it's a point at which we are measuring and bringing that data into the controller. And so the first thing to do is not think of it as a particular piece of hardware. Okay, so going back specifically to the question, what would be missing from the hydrometer is the pressure sensing. So a hydrometer does not have a pressure sensor built in. You would need to add that separately. One of the advantages to a hydrometer and one of the use cases that we see for it is installing that in places with a tight location because a hydrometer doesn't require upstream or downstream pipe diameter. So you can literally elbow right out of the device because it's a horizontal turbine. It's not a paddle wheel, so it doesn't need stream straightening, if you will. But fundamentally, a hydrometer can be set up and configured as a control point on the system.
So, Andy, if I took a hydrometer and added a baseline transducer to that, that would be essentially the equivalent of the control point that you were showing just a moment.
Yeah, just different pieces of hardware, but it's configured in the controller as a control point. Yep, and we can have control points. You can have one at the source. So we'll probably have to do a whole separate webinar on what a control point is. But we've sort of taken what's traditionally called the point of control or the POC and brought the POC downstream so you can put it at multiple places on your main line that you may wish to control the water pressure on the system.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at some of the chat and we're trying to funnel the questions to the Q&A, but I see two questions in the chat that I think are worth bringing up, and one that I think it's worth mentioning. It was a reminder from somebody in here that that pressure is only available on the base station 3200. It's not available on the base station 1000. So I think that is worth noting. That's one of the feature sets that's available in the 3200.
Yeah, and the terminology control point is a 3200 performance concept. It's not a concept introduced into the 1000.
Right. And then this is for Chris. I'm going to ask this because even though he says he's just kidding. It says, Chris, can you please let us know what the specific gravity of is for a beer once it has reached proper fermentation?
That is an excellent question. Again, relevant for today being National Beer Day. But that is completely dependent on style of beer and the ingredients and the grist build that went into the batch originally. So your finishing gravity or specific gravity is going to be different depending on what ingredients you used in that batch.
So Eric saw a rabbit hole and Chris is like going down the rabbit hole.
All right, let's come back out. We got a great question about a hydrometer and some confusion that we can, that I'll speak to, that a hydrometer can be both normally open and normally closed. So it can be ordered and reconfigured both ways. It does not need to be just normally closed.
Either normally open or either normally closed, but not both at the same time. Okay. Yeah. Good clarification.
Awesome.
Beautiful.
What about using a product like an Octave that's a mag meter rather than an impeller type flow sensor?
Beautiful. Beautiful. We get a lot better resolution on that. We can see a lower flows and a wider range of flows. There's no paddle wheel in there, so water isn't going to slide by nearly as much. The calibration is going to, the concept of calibrating flow, what's out there, is going to be exactly identical. It's just a different piece of hardware, and it would be included in the control point. If you're going to use a control point, it's included the same way.
Yes, absolutely. And our two-wire system is able to read those mag meters and report those flow values just as if it were a paddle wheel.
Yep. We've got another great question here on can the pressure sensor be used and sold separately? The pressure sensor comes as a kit with a pressure transducer and the necessary decoder to communicate with our controller. You can use the pressure sensor for other unique applications. I've had some applications where they're being used to manage water sources and water source priority out of cisterns. So if the water level were to drop in a cistern being measured by the pressure transducer, we can automatically switch between water source number 1, which would be a cistern, and water source number 2, which would be domestic, using the pressure transducer to do that.
Nice.
So there's another number of other unique applications for it.
Yeah, and a pressure sensor transducer could be installed anywhere on a main line or a lateral line if you want data from that point as a control point to manage operation of the system. Yes.
Excellent. Good questions.
The last questions, again, from Nick here. You can change the hydrometer in place. You don't need to order another one or remove it. If you want to switch from normally closed to normally open, it has to do with the way the micro tubing is ported on the device. So you can switch that in field.
Awesome.
Very good. All right. Well, we are at our half hour, gentlemen.
Okay.
Very good. And next week, we're going to be digging into Base Manager a little bit more. I'm going to be showing you some real world examples of some tips and tricks and some good data points with your sites, and some things that I look at remotely when people ask me to help them with their projects in different parts of the country. Some of the graphs I look at, and we're going to go deeper into Base Manager. So
awesome.
Appreciate everybody coming on with us today. Hope you can join us next week. And if you have any friends or colleagues or customers that you think would benefit from Baseline Tech Talk Tuesday, you can remind them to visit baselinetechtalk.com and register for the next webinar.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Cool.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate the input, the insight, information, and happy National Beer Day. Cheers.
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 Brew Crew.
See y'all next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.